Thanks very much, Kathy. Thanks for inviting me, and thanks for the opportunity to speak with all of you today. I've got some prepared remarks, and then I hope we'll get down to answering your questions and engage in some lively discussion and maybe even some lively debate. I'm going to talk a lot about statistics and trends and so forth. So let me start with a little passion, and that's the passion of the nonprofit sector. I'm sure if we were to go around this room today, every one of you could tell a story about how a nonprofit has made an impact on your life. We're here today in this gorgeous facility on this gorgeous campus because of a nonprofit organization. Your kids or your brothers and sisters may have gone to a school that made a difference in their lives. You may have a loved one right now at a hospital receiving care because of the work of a nonprofit. Some of you may have had a family member that was affected by a disease that we're now working on a cure that eventually will eradicate or mitigate that disease. So many of our community organizations have had an impact. So if we were to go around this room today, I'm sure many of you, and I hope some of you will later, tell me about the passion you have for the nonprofit sector and the difference it's made in your lives. And if we were to ask Americans across this country, I suspect every single American on a given day touches or is touched by a nonprofit organization. In fact, that's why most Americans give to a nonprofit organization, and that's why about half of all Americans volunteer some of their time. So the nonprofit sector is critical, is essential to our society, and yet despite its size and its essential nature of its work for our society, the sector is not always very well understood, and it's facing a variety of challenges today. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of those. And I've got some slides to help us along and hopefully provoke some discussion. Let's see if I've got this right. Whoops, I guess I don't. There we go. Now this is a slide that shows the number of charitable organizations in the United States. And that's part of what we normally have contact. But the Guidestar database includes 1.8 million nonprofits. It's a huge number, far surpassing that of any other country. It reflects the generosity, I think, something good about America, this can-do attitude that if we don't need to wait for somebody else, we don't need to wait for government, but we can take action and we can do something about this. And starting a nonprofit is relatively easy and inexpensive. And as a result, would you believe this? There's about 60,000 new nonprofits being created every year. And there's approximately twice the number that existed about 10 years ago. So that's part of the confusion of this sector. It's just its sheer size. Another reason is the complexity of the nonprofit sector. The nonprofit sector includes not only charities, which is what we typically think about, but it includes lobbying organizations, religious organizations, community organizations, membership and trade associations, and volunteer fire departments and PTAs. And they come with big budgets and small budgets, varying types of organizational structure, and enormous differences in responsibility. And this complexity often makes it difficult for the public to understand how nonprofits work. Yes, there are indeed hundreds of thousands of tiny nonprofits that depend on volunteers and public contributions for all the revenues, but there are also huge nonprofits with thousands of employees and hundreds of buildings and several billions in assets. This is a question that came up in some of our discussions today in the classrooms. It was confusing to students to learn that there were the billions of assets or hundreds of employees, as well as the very small and tiny that we know so well from our own personal lives. This diversity has left the public confused about what it means to be a nonprofit. And it's clear to me, anyway, that being a nonprofit does not mean having no revenues, or it does not mean having any profit necessarily. Without a balanced budget, a nonprofit couldn't serve its mission, at least for not very long. And from a legal perspective, being a nonprofit has more to do with the ultimate beneficiary of the profits or the assets, and exemptions from federal corporate taxes, and the opportunity for donors to receive charitable deductions in certain instances. So of course we assume that there is a public good, or there often should be, or there must be, but of course there's many other attributes about what a nonprofit means. In fact, as we look at the nonprofit sector, it collectively represents about 8% of all jobs in the United States and constitutes nearly 10% of GDP. And over a third of all revenues for nonprofits come from fees and dues. Another third comes from government grants and contracts, and less than 20% of the total nonprofit revenue comes from contributions from individuals like you. You'll have to excuse me, I'm suffering those springtime allergies today, which seems to be, it surprised me as I'm starting to collect those allergies as I get older. The size and importance of the nonprofit sector also mean it's catching the attention of the media more and more. Guidestar probably takes a phone call a day from a reporter writing a story about the nonprofit sector. Most of these calls today are about the impact of the economy. This is a slide that shows charitable giving, about $300 billion in 2007, shows how it has grown over the last 3 decades. It's been a steady growth pattern. Hardly a year has gone by when there's been any decline in funding, even in years where there's been a downturn in the economy. So the big question on the minds of reporters, and certainly to nonprofit executives today, is can we expect to see increases in 2008 and 2009, just like we've been seeing for the last few decades? At Guidestar, we've just completed a report. In fact, we're releasing it tomorrow. And if you'll allow me, I'll read a couple of headlines from this report that's coming out. We did a survey that over 3,000 charities responded to, and more than half of the organizations had already experienced a decrease in contributions from November, when we took the last survey, to March, when this survey was completed. About a third of the grant makers we spoke to are giving less money in grants over this 5-year period than what they gave before. And despite the economy and its effect on contributions, only 35% of organizations actually cut their budget from 2008 to 2009, which we found to be quite surprising. At the same time, they're reporting an increased need for their services, but don't see very high prospects for an increase in revenue over the next couple of months. At the same time, we've just also received a survey from the Foundation Center, and I'll report on that one as well. Of the more than 75,000 U.S. grant maker foundations, they increased their giving in 2008 by 2.8% to an estimated $46 billion. But here's the catcher in the story. Although foundation giving grew modestly in 2008, it did not grow as much as had been expected due to the extreme nature of the current economic downturn. Just under a third had predicted they would give less before the economic crisis took hold. And the final numbers came in at over 50% giving less. Findings from the Foundation Center's latest survey suggest that in 2009, foundation giving will decrease in the range of the high single digits to low double digits, even though estimated foundation assets declined a far greater 22% in 2008. So a grim prediction from the Foundation Center. And then finally, this report from the Association of Fundraising Professionals, which found that 46% of nonprofit organizations raised more money last year. And that would sound good, but according to the AFP, this was the smallest increase. They've been conducting the survey in the last 8 years. They had been predicting that 60% of fundraisers would see an increase in funding. And only 28% of the fundraisers surveyed believe their organizations will raise more money this year. So we're just now beginning to see the impact of what this crisis is going to mean for nonprofit organizations. And if we were to make a guess, we would probably have to say that that trend line I showed you will certainly flatten out for 2008, and we might even see a decrease begin to show in 2009. This impact of economics is causing reporters to call me up for a second topic, a topic we've never heard about before in the nonprofit sector, or not very much. For a long time now, people have been talking about whether there are too many nonprofits and possibly too much overlap and redundancy. Now with the economy in a downturn, this issue has achieved new urgency. Here's a couple of headlines from the Chronicle of Philanthropy. And let me just read you a couple of lines here from both the Chronicle and from the Nonprofit Times. The Chronicle's latest report says, the turbulent economy is creating new incentives for charities to cooperate. More organizations are starting to share fundraising and marketing ideas, while others are considering merging, combining back office to handle administrative duties or other formal alliances. And then they quote a consultant. He said, 5 years ago, if we did a training on restructuring and mergers, you wouldn't get a lot of people coming. And the people who came didn't want anyone else to know they were going to be there. He says, now it's almost become trendy. And the other quote from the Nonprofit Times says it all in the headline: the urge to merge is finally upon us. Now, I have my doubts. I've been in the nonprofit sector most of my life. And yes, we're now at the talk stage. But I think making it, creating these mergers or making it more difficult to start a new nonprofit might end up, in the end, stifling creativity and passion. One of the things that I like about the nonprofit sector is its diversity. It's diversity that really reflects the diversity of America. So I think it's probably best left to the donors and the leaders of nonprofit organizations certainly to cut back. However, I'm a big believer in the philosophy that in crisis comes opportunity. The economic crisis may finally force nonprofit organizations to take a hard look at what they do and what they do best, and whether it can be more efficiently or more effectively done by others or with others. So that'll be an interesting trend to watch in the nonprofit sector. And then finally, one other big subject. So we've got the economy, we've got mergers, and then there's, of course, President Obama's talk about a tax deduction, or a reduction in deductions, is how people are calling it. Here's how the Chronicle puts it. When President Obama outlined a plan last month to transform our economy for the 21st century, he dropped a bombshell that surprised the charitable world. To help pay for a plan to reshape the country's healthcare system, which he called a huge drag on the economy, President Obama proposed limiting the federal tax breaks that wealthy people can get for their itemized deductions, including donations to charities starting in 2011. To many nonprofit leaders and experts, the announcement felt like another body blow at a time when charities are under severe strain because of the recession. To pay for $318 billion of the fund for health care, President Obama proposed limiting the tax break that families earning more than $250,000 can get for the deductions they itemize on their tax returns. As you can imagine, this has opened up a huge debate, and we won't go into it now, but the Washington Post has been running an interesting series of articles, both pro and con, about how this will either reduce charitable contributions or is a reasonable way to be paying for some of the health care reforms so many people in the nonprofit sector wants. So that's an interesting story to stay tuned about over the coming months. And maybe, I hope it'll be a discussion that you all want to talk about. At its heart, all of these discussions about the size of the nonprofit sector and the complexity of the nonprofit sector and how to fund it also have a big impact on what it means to be a donor in our society today and the kind of relationship that we want to have with nonprofits that we support. Most Americans want to give to charity. In fact, as I told you, most Americans are to some degree, and they want to do their part. We want to feel like we're helping to make a difference. But more and more, we're beginning to worry about whether the charities we support are honest, or are well-run, or are ultimately effective. And one of the most exciting and yet challenging developments over the past decade has been the growth and expansion of the internet, which is fueling a highly informed and highly engaged public. I say exciting because the public is involved in the not-for-profit sector like never before. This connection provides nonprofits with unlimited opportunities to involve the public in positive, constructive ways, which I believe will increase the capacity to reach those whom they serve like we've never imagined. And at the same time, I say challenging because the increased access to information certainly accelerated by nonprofit and for-profit scandals has increased the public's scrutiny. As I've witnessed these changes, I've concluded and I've begun to call this the era of assumed virtue being over. And when I say that, I'm not suggesting that nonprofits are necessarily doing something wrong or improper, but we live in a world today where we're demanding more from all of our institutions, whether they're nonprofits, whether they're government agencies, whether they're educational institutions, whether they're religious organizations. We want our teachers to be tested and their children to be tested so we can find out if our schools are actually teaching our children properly. We're asking government to be more accountable. There is a push against things like earmarks. There are new websites going on that list not only earmarks but grant proposals and other kinds of government funding. We're asking our religious institutions to be more transparent. We're asking all of our institutions to be more transparent and more accountability. And there's no reason to expect that our nonprofit institutions shouldn't be transparent and accountable as well. A second part of this new era today is the internet provides us all with a greater opportunity to be personally engaged. And the internet is both a way to accomplish this, but also a facilitator. What we're seeing today is a change in donor expectations, where donors no longer want to just provide a gift. They want to be engaged with that organization. They want to know what it does. They want to know its successes. They want to know about its failures. They want to know about its accomplishments. And so this is putting new expectations on nonprofit organizations to share with donors more information about its activities. And then finally, We live in a world today where we're expecting more data. Those of you going to a restaurant tonight, I'm sure, will want to look at Zagat's or Yelp or some other service before you go to that restaurant. Those of you probably went to U.S. News and World Report and lots of other sources before you chose which university to go to. We use data now in every aspect of our lives, whether it's as simple as buying a refrigerator or buying a car, or it's the daily decisions of our lives. And so this demand for data is also having an impact on the choices we make about nonprofit organizations. For that matter, organizations, corporations, and businesses alike are under the consumer-informed microscope. This massive information gathering and sharing ability has created new opportunities for the nonprofit sector. It's also been a catalyst for increased transparency and accountability, both of which are important, if not vital, if this information-hungry environment, important for organizations to gain and maintain public trust, prevent scandalous activity, and move forward more successful than ever. Transparency is all about being open about our programs, our outcomes, our finances, our goals, and being readily willing to share that information with donors, with regulators, with the general public, with all of your stakeholders. It's the accessibility of information to stakeholders of institutions regarding matters that affect their interests. Being transparent is a process that requires organizations to adapt to a new culture. I think it's one we're still trying to adapt to. Those most successful are active in their transparency when organizations consciously decide to be transparent to achieve their goals. Active transparency means transparency is practiced in practically everything an organization does and is evidenced on your website, in advertising, at organizational events, and in media interviews, and in the actions, products, and services that a company produces every single day. Whenever the organization and its people do anything, they communicate the organization's priorities and values. Open enterprises have the ability to ensure that active transparency in all its dimensions consistently reinforces the priorities and their values. An active transparency, I think, is going to require a cultural change that has to be embraced at the top of every nonprofit organization with the leaders and with the board, and then throughout the entire organization. It needs a management to understand and communicate that transparency is a benefit rather than a curse, and working toward creating such a culture. I don't believe that organizations can afford to operate in a culture of minimal disclosure anymore, because they will fail to respond to donor needs and to donor expectations. Along with this newfound ability to research nonprofits is a growing expectations for the nonprofits to measure accountability. More donors want assurances that their time and money are being judiciously spent. They are still believers in the good work, that passion I talked about before, of the nonprofits, and are willing to support, but tread more carefully before committing. You could say they have adopted the Russian proverb that Ronald Reagan made famous: trust but verify. And verify they will. They mine the internet and other sources for information to gather data about organizations. A great parallel to how this shift has affected the nonprofit sector is the healthcare industry, particularly physicians. Like nonprofits, they serve the public good. Many have noble aspirations, but yet increasingly they've come under public scrutiny. If you don't believe me, talk to your doctor the next time you go in for a checkup. The older ones can tell you about their glory days, when they were practically looked upon as deity because of their medical training, advanced knowledge, and ability to diagnose and heal. They will also tell you that the information age has demoted them to mere mortals, whose judgment is being questioned by internet-savvy 80-year-olds, like my mother, I can say for a fact, who come to appointments armed with information on how best to diagnose and treat their particular ailments. In this way, the web is making MDs of us all. Today, donors want more than transparency. They demand accountability, and increasingly, they want to measure effectiveness. The public's demanding numbers. They want to know about nonprofit operations. They want to know how effective an organization is in providing the services promised. They want to be assured that nonprofits are doing what they say they will do. Donors want to know the impact of their giving. They want outcomes and they want measurements. And they share, by the way, that information with colleagues and friends and in blogs and in emails. The internet has become a global conversation tool to build communities of people using similar products and services, in this case the nonprofit sector, a tool to air views with other users, to share even attitudes and biases. People love to talk and share their experiences, and what we see now is only the beginning. Here's a quote from Scott Rafer, who writes in iMedia. Blogging itself is the leading indicator of what customer interaction will be like in an always-on internet world, where customers must be listened to because they are easily able to listen to each other. The ability that donors have to rapidly gather information and then share that information and their own experiences with others empowers and engages them in ways that can't be ignored. The for-profit world certainly recognizes this and is beginning to respond. Recognizing this power shift to consumers, many businesses and organizations are educating their employees and salespeople, from realtors to pharmaceutical representatives, on how to deal with what they call the internet-empowered consumer. We at Guidestar have been thinking about this, and here's just a few ways we're beginning to use social media at Guidestar. Several weeks ago, we launched a new partnership with a Silicon Valley-based organization called Great Nonprofits. With their help, donors, volunteers, and program recipients can now share their experiences and opinions of a nonprofit organization with others. Donors are now telling us about the good experiences they've had with how their gifts were received or their opportunities to talk to management. Program recipients are telling us about the services they received and how they were treated by nonprofits. Volunteers are telling us about the nature of their experiences as a volunteer and the work they were able to do. We're now beginning to share our data with such organizations as Causes on Facebook, giving people an opportunity to organize their friends to help support their personal causes. We're now seeing Twitter used more and more for raising money and even evaluating nonprofit activity. And tomorrow, we at Guidestar will be launching, with yours truly, a new blog full of ideas and lively exchanges with users across the country, which will give me an opportunity to begin to interact with some of our users and engage them in discussions about transparency and accountability. At Guidestar, we're committed to helping organizations become transparent, and we have tools and systems in place to help guide nonprofits through this reporting process, and of course encourage them to actively use Guidestar as a tool to communicate and provide information to their constituencies. Our mission is to revolutionize philanthropy. We like that term, to revolutionize philanthropy and non-practice by harnessing the power of information that advances transparency, enables users to make better decisions, and also encourages charitable giving. We encourage nonprofits to share information about their organizations openly and completely, and we try to help the public make sense of this information so they can make better and more informed decisions while also building more effective and efficient organizations. Data is a first step in building information and ultimately knowledge. We believe that transparency benefits everyone. It's good for nonprofits, good for those who they serve and support, and good for those who benefit from the services provided by charitable foundations. I think when we look back, perhaps less than a decade from now, we'll realize that this added push to be transparent and accountable was good for the nonprofit sector. Not easy, difficult, challenging, but good for the sector. We'll realize that active transparency developed a better culture of trust that we've never fully enjoyed before, and created an environment that better engaged our publics. They became stronger supporters, more connected to our passions. We will also realize that increased openness and trust benefited organizations internally as well. Employees engaged in this transparency process learn to trust their organizations, and they have pride in what they do, leading to greater opportunities for public good. And they tend to serve constituencies, both consumers and donors, more effectively. By increasing our understanding of effectiveness, donors made better and more effective decisions and increased their charitable giving. Nonprofit organizations became more effective and more efficient, and thereby increased their impact. More charitable dollars went to high-performing organizations. The nonprofit sector has the potential to not only weather this year's economic crisis, but come out of it stronger with more impact than ever. So I'm positive about the future, and I thank you for your time today. I'm looking forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. A lot of great things to talk about, and because we are recording this session, I would ask that you wait for the microphone before asking your question so we can get it on tape. I'm actually going to ask the first question, the privilege of the microphone, which is, you talked a lot about not-for-profit groups needing to measure outcomes. That's a very ambitious mission that Guidestar has, revolutionizing philanthropy. I'd like to hear a little bit of how you have set the example by measuring your own outcomes.
Sure, and let me kind of put this in context. I think there was a time, and I would say probably virtually most giving today is still to organizations that we have some connection to, a religious institution, our schools, a health-related issue. So we're talking here about a relatively small amount, but as we saw from the charts, a relatively small amount is still a lot of money. And we had some interesting dialogues with students this afternoon that my own sense is that this is too important to be left up to chance, that we need to make sure that our money is being spent wisely and having an impact. And so we're helping all nonprofits in terms of by asking them how do they measure success as just a first step. Getting to outcomes and 10-year studies is something beyond our control, but can we begin to measure some of the impact of our work? And so we've got a series of questions we ask all nonprofits, and then we have a series of questions for ourselves. And we went through a transformation of our own definition of our mission and how we measure our success. And so our board has a very systematic exercise it goes through every year to try to measure the impact we want to have, that the board adopts. And then those all become part of our departmental plans. It's of course reflected in our budget, how we allocate our resources, but then in all of our individual plans as well. And so they take a lot of time and effort about measuring impact, because we do want to make a difference, and we do want to revolutionize philanthropy. Other questions? There's one over there.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm wondering if you've ever considered selling ad space on the website in order to generate more revenue for the organization, or if you think that's in conflict with the mission of the organization.
That's a good question. There are some rules about IRS rules that we have to be concerned about with advertising revenue, because that's considered taxable or if it gets to a certain size. But as you may know, I spent many years in public broadcasting, and we were there to varying degrees of success, able to find ways to have sponsors, underwriters of both our public radio and our public television programs, and do it in such a way that it did not harm our charitable purpose or the mission of our organizations. So we have been thinking, there are lots of, I think, internet-based nonprofits that are beginning to ask this question right now, because so much of content on the internet is supported through advertising. The 100-pound gorilla in all this, of course, is Google. And Google has a very generous program where it does supply free advertising for nonprofit organizations. So we've been able to use that, but we have not at this point considered putting advertising on our site. I think it's an interesting question that we're going to have to deal with this year. 98% of all users to Guidestar use us at no charge. We've got about an $11 million budget, so it does cost money for us to aggregate and manage and then present all of this data. So we do have real costs, and so there are some arguing for many nonprofits that providing free services on the internet and having those supported by advertising would be a good way for the not-for-profit sector to get closer to sustainability. It may take someone like yourself to start a new website and try it out, so you ought to give it a try.
Appreciate your remarks. The majority of the money that's donated, my sense is, comes principally from people 50 and older, and yet we've seen with Obama and others the tremendous ability to raise money in smaller amounts, which is probably more likely to come from people in the 20, 30-year-old age cohort. And do you have a sense in terms of who uses your site? The younger generation, do you find them maybe tying in with creating causes in Facebook, or do you have a sense that the older folks like myself are becoming more internet savvy and in fact are taking advantage of the resources that you have? Right,
yeah. Trends are changing as the internet kind of takes over all of our lives. It was definitely the case maybe 5 or 10 years ago that the internet contributor was much younger. That's becoming less so. What's really been exciting about the internet is its ability to encourage small gifts and to build new communities of interest. We provide the data, the underlying data for such giving portals as Network for Good and Just Give, and they provide hundreds, tens at least, perhaps hundreds of millions of dollars every year to nonprofit organizations. They find that giving opportunities online give an opportunity for people to give easier, often to give more because they're using a credit card, to engage in more immediacy than you might otherwise. And so internet giving is still pretty small in terms of the overall giving, but we're seeing big increases of 50 to 100% or more as a percentage of overall giving. I think just think in my own life, I order my airplane tickets online. I do much of my purchases online. I do all of my communication online. So I don't think it's too many years away for us to expect that most of our giving may turn online as well as, and that will be across demographics. I think I gave a talk a couple of weeks ago, and a nonprofit manager, after hearing me talk about the impact of the internet, kind of raised her hand, and she was, I guess anxious was the word. She said, I'm using direct mail, I'm using public events, I'm using lunches, I'm using all sorts of ways to reach my donors, and now you're telling me I've got to do all these other sorts of things as well. I just don't have enough time and enough energy to do it. And we talked about it among the group, and I think what we're learning is we have to, the internet has as many opportunities to create network and to create relationships as it has to create more work for us. And so I think this is not going to happen overnight. This is going to be a gradual experience, change in experience, and it may work better for now with certain demographics than for others. A person over 50 is probably in a better position right now to give a large gift, but if we can get a young person to give $10 because their friends are all giving $10, and to be part of the community, or begin to think about philanthropy as part of what they do, I think that's a good trend that can only get better.
Thanks. You touched on the issue of the people who use your site and their demographic characteristics a minute ago, but I wonder what you could tell us about older people, maybe people 60 and older, and what you have been able to learn about their usage patterns of the web or how they adopt technology from your work at Guidestar.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think similar to the last question, it is changing. I think, again, this is a work in progress. Most people still give to organizations that they know something about. And for those organizations, you're not likely to do a lot of research about. Certainly not on the internet. Although I did talk to someone last week who said, I give to the 3 same charities every year. I give, I forget what they were. He said, but before I give, I write my checks, I always look on Guidestar to see if there's anything new or are there any big surprises that have happened during the last year. So I think for the average donor with their average contributions, we're not likely to see an increase in the internet in huge amounts, but it will continue to trend towards using. I think traditionally, the person who still writes checks is less likely to use the internet to making their contributions. A person who uses the internet for every aspect of their life finds that using the internet helps them in making their charitable contributions, because not only do they have, they just have researches and files and access to credit cards and so forth that they might not always have. So I think, as I said before, I think the amount of overall giving on the internet is still a relatively small piece of the pie, but it's growing very rapidly, and it's growing rapidly across all demographics. So I think it's going to be less of an age issue as every year passes.
I'm one of the old timers that fella talked about, and I still write checks. In your conversation with us, you mentioned you yourself make gifts via the internet or do most everything in the internet. Would you be happy making a $5,000 gift and then getting a form return from the organization? So where's the personal approach to donors in the internet?
I think that's a key. I think that's a key factor. I think that's a great question. You're right. The internet does encourage if we're not careful, a kind of impersonalization, and that's not good for fundraising, and it's not good for the donor, and it's not good for the nonprofit. I think part of the obligation of the nonprofit organization is to then find new ways to create that sense of community. So to reference back to that person I spoke to who felt a little anxious about all this, they're going to have to continue to do the lunches and the special events. At this lunch, another donor gave an anecdote that I'll repeat here. He said, I'll give you 2 examples of what happened to me recently as a donor. In the first instance, a representative of a nonprofit organization came to visit me personally. And he said, I told this person ahead of time, don't expect very much money from me because I don't think my wife and I want to contribute to your organization. And she said, well, I'd like to come by anyway. And as a result of that visit and as a result of that personal conversation, this individual ended up giving a much larger gift than he would have otherwise because of the personal nature of it. And he felt connected to that nonprofit. I think for some people, they'll be able to find that sense of community with some of these new internet tools. For them, a social networking experience or a Facebook experience or some of the Twitter experiences may be what they're looking for in terms of a sense of community. For others of us, nothing will ever substitute from personal contact, from going out to visit that organization, from being able to communicate one-on-one with that organization. But I think so nonprofits are going to have to figure out what works for them and what works for their donors most effectively, and continue to find ways to make that connection work.
Hi, you all have a donate or give now button on the Guidestar website. Is that successful, and do you track the amounts that come through?
We do. We have a partnership with the Giving Portal Network for Good. And part of the reason why we put it up there is because we knew people were coming to our site to do research, but we weren't giving them a chance to donate, so they had to go somewhere else. And so we've had about $1 million donated to nonprofits in the last 6 months from that site. We find we have 2 kinds of users coming to our site. One half are what I would call finders. They know exactly what they want. It may be an organization they give to every year or one they've heard about, and so they want to find it on the site. And then there are searchers, and the searchers don't know what they're looking for yet. They may have just come into some money, there may be a cause that excites them, and they're trying to find the right organization that matches with their needs and their interests.
Hi, you talked a lot about transparency and trying to help organizations become more transparent. Yeah, with online giving and all the different giving portals and online giving vendors, kind of opens up a whole another realm of what transparency means with hidden transaction fees or different things like that. Is Guidestar doing anything to help charities kind of navigate what the different transparency issues may be with the different online sources?
Sure, we do. I mean, I think you talk about fees. Transparent means being able to make either giving donors a choice about whether they want to pay those fees or not, but certainly making sure that the donor knows that there's going to be a fee in certain instances. One of the big issues these days with nonprofits who do collect donations online is that there are certain transaction costs. There's the cost of the credit card, there's the cost of the other fees engaged in actually getting those dollars to the nonprofit organization. Some giving portals will absorb those costs. Others are trying to pass them on or asking donors to make a choice about whether the donor wants to pay those or whether they want the nonprofit to pay those. And we're doing a lot of work with nonprofits to help them kind of navigate through these various transaction fees. But I think at the end, donors are looking for a sense that organizations are willing to share that financial information. And by the way, compensation's another big issue for many donors today, and a big issue for those who view the sector. They want organizations to be able to explain what they're paying their employees and why they're doing that.
I was curious about the great nonprofits, the commentary program.
Yes.
And what's your plan for negative comments? Just thinking about a lot of nonprofits offer very complex or controversial services, and sometimes those services may not be appreciated by the recipients immediately. It could be that years down the road the recipient understands the value of the service they got. Or sometimes you have board members, I'm thinking about boards I've sat on where people are extremely opinionated. So I'm just wondering what, not that there's going to be censorship or vetting, but what the plan is.
We were concerned about this as well, and we've tested this out in Pittsburgh and in San Francisco. And so far, we've had the opposite problem, which is all of the reviews are overwhelmingly positive. But we do a couple of things to make sure. First, all the comments are vetted. We want to make sure that they're within some zone of reasonableness and that they're credible. And then secondly, before we post that, we give the nonprofit an opportunity to write a response, and then we post that on the site as well. We've talked a lot to foundations about this, and foundations are very positive about this concept. The way one foundation director told me a little while ago is to say that they think it's important to know how this nonprofit is viewed within its community. And as a foundation, they want to know what do volunteers think about them, what does the broader community think about that nonprofit and how it's run, and the quality of its services. And they consider that one of the measurements of the effectiveness of that organization. So I think you have to realize these comments are probably happening anyway. They're probably happening in your neighborhood or in the hallway someplace. And so if we can bring them online and engage those who are making these comments, it'll ultimately be better for the nonprofit. And I'll tell you, as a manager of a nonprofit, we spend a lot of our time soliciting comments from our users. because we want to be better, and we know we have a lot that we can do to get better. So we're always eager to hear what people have to say about us. But I think it's the opportunity to kind of harness this energy a little bit and engage the commentators. That's ultimately going to be the best interest for everybody.
One more question, and that's, you take the approach of providing information and letting your users form their own opinions. There are the so-called rating agencies out there that take data and publish opinions. Charity Navigator and Wise Giving Alliance being two of them.
Right.
Do you have an opinion as to the validity or the effectiveness of that approach versus your approach? And I'll ask you an opinion which sort of exposes my opinion with respect to Charity Navigator in particular, in that they present themselves as being the place where you should go before you make any decision. And as a nonprofit who's asked to be rated by them, we're in a queue that is of indefinite length. So on the one hand, they're saying use us, but on the other hand, you can't get rated by them.
Right. Well, I have another problem with Charity Navigator. I'll add to yours, and I think the problem with Charity Navigator is it's looking at a couple of financial metrics that are not always the best way to measure a nonprofit organization. So they're taking a 990, they're looking at a ratio number or an issue about your reserves, and they're thereby judging whether that's a good organization or not. And our view is a review of an organization ought to start by looking at its mission. What is it trying to do? What are its programs? And how effective is it being at accomplishing its goals? Finances comes a little bit later in the series of questions you ask, and may not always be the most important. Sometimes finances can tell you something about the capabilities of that organization. Is it going to be able to do what it says it wants to do? But a lot of times, finances are not the most important way to judge an organization. I get a lot of calls from reporters saying, talk to me about ratios. And I say, that's a bad place to start. And I give you an example. What if an organization finds that there is unusual demand for its services, an economic crisis, a weather-related crisis? And so the board has an emergency meeting, and they decide, because of the unusual demand for its services, it's going to spend all of its money this year. It's going to spend down its reserves, and it's going to give extra services. Now, at the end of the year, its finances may look terrible. Its ratios may look terrible. It's going to end up with a terrible review from Charity Navigator. Now, was that a good decision for that organization or a bad one? And I think there are lots of instances like that where the roof collapses, the boiler breaks, there's a special opportunity, there's a special crisis where finances may not be the real true measure of that organization. The approach we've taken at Guidestar is that each donor comes to a giving decision with his or her own sets of values and own sets of priorities. Some may want to only fund organizations that have been around for a long time and have a big endowment. Others may be looking for organizations that are cutting edge, that are doing the really, really hard things that no one else is doing. And because they're more difficult, it may be harder for them to earn money. And so every individual has their own set of personal values, their own set of priorities. And so we think to judge a charity, or at least to limit the ways to measure charity is a risky proposition. Having said that, though, I will recognize that organizations like Charity Navigator and some of the other rating services are scratching an itch. They are responding to a need from some people. I mentioned in my prepared remarks the use we have of consumer reports and Zagat's and surveys. And there is a percentage of American donors who are looking for that rating for a nonprofit. They're looking for the equivalent of the consumer reports or the equivalent of the PE ratio in stocks. And we try to say it doesn't exist. It's too complicated. And that's not a very satisfactory answer for some donors. So I think we at Guidestar are trying to find out, trying to identify some simple ways to both understand and to guide donors in their decision so that they will make better decisions, but still leave in some of that individual choice.